I guess we're about ready to get on with the next part of our program here today. My name is Alan Westhaver. I'm very excited to have been here today and to participate. Thanks very much to Glenn and ICLR for making that possible. I'd say today is definitely a benchmark as far as I'm concerned. To see a room in Canada, to see a room full of fire managers and insurance people, it's long overdue. It's very important, and it's great to see that we've had this opportunity to interact today. There's been a lot of good information passing back and forth, and to me that's a start of something that's really good and will be productive in the future. So good on you guys for organizing that, Glenn. Most of my career, 30-some years in Parks Canada, has been involved in the fire management program, and as was mentioned, I'm representing Parks Canada and chairing this working group to develop an interagency, a wildland interagency fire smart strategy. And as well, I guess my interest in the wildland urban interface stretches way back to the early 90s. It's an issue for us too in national parks, and it was casting a big shadow on our whole fire management program. And then along came Kelly O'Shea and a few other wise people who kicked off the idea of partners in protection, and I've been involved with them ever since in many different capacities. So that's it's a big interest, and I'm glad to see we're moving the yardsticks ahead today. So as I mentioned, today's program really had two purposes. I won't say that Glenn had an ulterior motive, but aside from exchanging all of this information, he's brought us here today and with the idea that eventually, in a short span of time, there will be a position paper put together on behalf of the insurance industry about the wildland urban interface. And our task today, Glenn's kind of set out several questions, 3 questions, objectives relating to that, and also so I put together a series of questions. What we're going to try to do is amass some ideas and throw some thoughts out there so that the people that are putting together this position paper can kind of expand on those ideas. But we really want to take advantage of the talents and the experiences that are here in this room today over the next, well, let's give ourselves half an hour. As Paul was talking about being adaptation and adaptable, we'll have to, I think we're going to adapt this little exercise to the time and space that we've got available to us. So let's set ourselves a limit. We'll throw up some questions there and get to work. I realize that some people may have to be escaping to catch the subway or whatever on schedules here to get back to home. So I guess that's, if you need to leave, go right ahead. If others want to stick it out for this half hour, we could kind of reconfigure ourselves and come up to the front here. But we'll take off on that.
Just maybe for anybody that does have to leave early, can you put up an email address they can use to respond with any comments they have?
We definitely will, and I think what we'll do, we might even do better than that, Peter. We will send out, maybe PDF this entire presentation and send it out with the questions so that people have some afterthoughts or want to take this home and do some homework. They can send this back within the next week or 10 days or less. Let's say a week. Get your thoughts to Tracy Waddington from ICLR, and then she will forward those to Brian Stocks and Peter Fuglin that are taking the lead in putting this paper together. So our time is short. There's the, if you want to take this with you, there's Tracy's email address. So we heard a lot of good things today. I'm not going to, I was thinking about summarizing those, but I think that we'll cut that short. but there's a few very important nuggets. Many times throughout the day, we're coming back to fuel. It's one of those things that can be changed or modified in the fire environment, and that's something that perhaps we should be focusing on and thinking about over as we go through this exercise. This is my newly adopted home of Fernie in British Columbia in 1908. We've had some great examples of what can happen, but on August 1st, 1908, I guess on the 31st of July, it was a booming little town of 5,000 to 6,000 people, and here we are on August 1st with 37 structures left standing in the entire town, and a fire that passed through in 90 minutes, basically incinerating the town. So I guess there's some lessons here that we're relearning from the past. Some interesting quotes from a guy named William Fernie that if you haven't seen them, they're worthwhile. I'm going to quickly move through, but some of these points. It was very interesting to hear Carl's points and have a little window on our future from the United States. The points brought up by State Farm and some of the things that they're taking on. I think they provide some really good examples of things that could happen in Canada as well. And maybe we'll want to come back to those ideas later on. Good perspectives by the insurance panel as well. And there's little left to be said about the comments and what Jamie and Mark brought forward about their experience. Except that kind of the perspective that houses are just more fuel. Looking at it from a fire's perspective, that's important. And again, there was a lot of emphasis on the importance of partnerships, and that idea was expanded upon a lot by Adam and Kelly, talking about partners in protection and their availability as a nonprofit organization to be coming up with answers, and the fact that a lot of these solutions, the answers are known. There's a few rockets there on the launch pad that we just need to light the fuse on. Also, one idea that, going back to Carl's comments, that the importance of a comprehensive communications and awareness program rather than being much more effective than a kind of one-off or kind of a glitzy type ad campaign, or just that there is a need for a comprehensive program if we were to be effective. So we also learned a lot about how homes ignite and the effectiveness of firefighting resources, and the fact that it really is a team sport, this wildland-urban interface. And over it was brought out today that the responsibility for dealing with these solutions has to be shared, and it has to be pushed downwards. I think Carl used the term driven downwards to the people that really own the problem, and the homes and the backyards. Adam covered this, the Portuguese flag, very important there, and what we're focusing is definitely on the right-hand side where most of the losses are occurring. And I think this is the real breakthrough. This is the important part about having the wildland fire people here together with the insurance people, because the insurance industry has a really positive and good relationship with homeowners. You are connected. Us wildland guys really aren't. That's what's missing in this picture. Kelly emphasized that too, that we really need to get this program into backyards, and you have that relationship. And maybe there's a way of building on that. And thinking ahead to what Kim was telling us about mutual aid and resource sharing, maybe the challenge is just a matter of sharing not airplanes and firefighters, but maybe we just need to share our communication expertise and our ability to share information and pass that information down to the grassroots. So an interesting little diagram here that I think sums up a lot of information brought to us by, this is used by the US Firewise people, but it boils down to kind of the anatomy of a wildfire disaster. How do we break this cycle? We keep rebuilding, burning, rebuilding, recovering. How do we break that cycle? And the point of this diagram is that the critical stage is when a wildfire moves into a community, many structures are ignited, and that's where kind of the wheels come off. The trick is, if we can keep a lot of structures from igniting simultaneously, maybe we can break this cycle. So I think that's a good explanation of where collectively we can focus some energy here. I'll move on because we want to get to these questions. We've heard a lot of good information today, and we can send this out in a PDF. And lastly, the Canadian Wildland Fire Strategy, even though it was built in 2005, there's a lot of great forethinking done on this. It's very valid. If you haven't seen it, it's worth grabbing off the internet and taking a look at. The background documents are really strong and really help our understanding. So on to the 3 objectives of this session. What we want to do is we want to try to brainstorm these ideas, and what I've done is just seeded out a few questions that are relevant. The first task that we want to do here is figure out how can we raise the profile of this issue with various governments so that we can get them on board as partners and move this issue ahead. And this is where we need to start getting interactive, because I guess my job is to ask the questions, and hopefully we can peel out some ideas from the crowd here. So first of all, do we think that's worthwhile? Which governments need to be reached? How do we influence them? You know, what can we say to them that will make them come on board? What are the key messages? And what kind of assistance would we be looking for from governments to work with us collectively to move this issue ahead? So, some thoughts. Brian and Peter are going to be keeping notes here, and I might put a few things on the flip chart too.
Hi, Kevin Smart. I guess from an insurance perspective, the first thing we'd like to know which risks are which communities are most at risk. Trying to attack it at a federal or provincial level might be too broad in terms of what we could do. When you think about insurance brokers in their community, they may have influence with local municipal governments. So it would probably be good to know which towns specifically have some risk. Is it Cold Lake? Is it Jasper? Mm-hmm. And start at that level to influence.
Well, I guess in general, if it would help our discussion move ahead, it's quite safe to say that there are probably in the order of hundreds of communities in most provinces that are at risk. And as we've seen, it doesn't have to be forest. It could be grasslands. There's been 3 or 4 communities with major evacuations in December, January in Alberta because of grass fires. It could be bush, it could be tall pine trees. Anywhere that's got flammable wildland fuels and the right conditions can be at risk. It could be agricultural communities, it doesn't have to be forest-based communities. So it's safe to assume that virtually every province and territory has got many, many communities that are at risk at some time or another. And it's true that it's worse in some places than others, but this is a widespread problem.
But I think you're
Hold on.
Yeah, I think what your
Uh-huh.
question is to
Yeah.
be useful to your industry, to the insurance industry, you need to know degree, right? You need to know, is this somewhat at risk or is it a high risk? And that helps you in terms of determining whether wildfire is an issue in terms of insurance incentives for those type of communities. So it actually is a bit of a different question
Mm-hmm.
from what's being asked.
Sorry, I missed the nuance there.
Okay.
Thanks, Peter.
In terms of influencing governments, I can't remember who it was that was speaking, but there was a pretty telling slide there that talked about the prevention and the recovery costs and the costs of damage. And I think getting that message through to every level of government is going to be helpful. It's one thing to come in after the fact with aid and try and recover from an event, and getting that ounce of prevention out there, that was a pretty telling slide to help influence the expenditure of money in advance.
So the fiscal impact is something that would be carry the mail a little bit in terms of raising the profile of the issue, yeah?
I guess I have more of a question is why do the governments need to be influenced at all? Why don't they just
I guess
come and do something about it?
that is one of the questions on board too. Do we think that that is a useful approach? I'm not taking it for granted, but that was one of the objectives and thoughts of ICLR, that government does need to be involved at some point. I think there is a national disaster mitigation strategy, and certainly a lot of federal funding goes into recovery. Perhaps some of the thinking is that kind of an ounce of prevention may result in less expenses at the other end. Again, coming back to dollars.
I guess it would be very useful because then information would be available to us, and then we could also do our side of the work. And when we're talking about data and quality and any source of any type of information, something that the government has, if they can make it available, then yes, that would be very useful.
Mm-hmm. So that's something you can work with, Brian?
I guess, you know, when it goes right back to the strategy, Al. When we were working on the strategy, you know, we had buy-in from all levels of government. And if you look at the strategy, it talks about the federal role, provincial territorial role, and the municipal role. And not just with respect to Fire Smart, but just thinking about fire in general.
Mm-hmm.
And there seemed to be, the fact of the matter is that when that came out in 2005, it was signed by every agency. And it was signed by representatives of the federal government. So far, at that end, you can see from Kim's talk that the provinces and the territories are struggling along, trying to make some things happen. But in fact, the larger influx of money that would be required, particularly from the federal government, just so far isn't there. And it seems obvious to us if we think that we're if the provinces are responsible for wildfire protection on the land, and the federal government is somewhat responsible for public health and safety, that where the two cross is looking at protecting communities. And that's, to us, painfully obvious. The question is, how do we take something like Slave Lake and actually keep their attention long enough, or keep their feet to the fire long enough to be able to achieve something? And that's I guess what we're talking about here right now, is there some way in which the insurance industry, you know, can be thinking along those lines too? Is there a way that insurance industry is promoting Fire Smart community protection, you know, in terms of not just relating to homeowners and communities, but also looking at, as Carl talked about, grants to different organizations to try to promote that sort of thing on a larger scale? Is it possible that the insurance industry could lobby for that sort of thing?
Related to raising the profile of governments, there were two takeaways I had today that really got my attention. Part is the discussion we're having right now, that Peter's chart, where there's all kinds of pressure on governments to control spending and be efficient and careful with spending. And in this area, that's led to a discussion, could more money on prevention save suppression costs? And have they got that balance right? And to broaden that discussion to say save suppression costs and damage costs would be a really healthy contribution to a dialogue of what we really want governments to do. And on this issue, what that actually changes, I forget the number for what Alberta's promised to spend in Slave Lake, 289 million or whatever the number is. That's probably the accurate number of what Alberta wrote a check for. But in a few months' time, they're going to run up to Ottawa and ask for half the money back. So Ottawa is actually paying half of that, or whatever the number is. And they just haven't been asked. And I don't know what the number was out of Kelowna, but BC paid the initial amount and then later on asked Ottawa for 200 from Ottawa, right? So when Ottawa keeps saying, why should Ottawa back Fire Smart or whatever? Well, right, you invest in the prevention and you save on the suppression, you save on the damage. Ottawa actually saves money as well as the province is saving money if you can present that in that way. But the second part I had as a takeaway today, there was a real emotional draw here. And it wasn't just our colleagues from Slave Lake saying, you know, that's my sister-in-law's house. And, you know, it's been a year and I still can't look at these pictures. That was amazing. But all of our friends from the insurance industry, fire's just different. This is really a very different issue. And when I have to deal with clients on a fire claim, it's not like having the town blow away in a windstorm or whatever. This is a fire, you know. That was really powerful, the emotional side of this. And governments are ultimately people. And so I think the combination of the financial efficiency presented in a broader way, as Peter offered the context for that, is very creative, tied with the emotional side, is essential, I think, for how to raise the profile of this issue. And it's not just a fire, not just one other event on a list of, what's the list of the 10 big events or something. This is much more than that. This is something where the government hasn't figured out how to really manage its resources efficiently, and governments hate to hear, you know, they haven't got that job right, and this is really emotional.
You know, this discussion, when you were talking, Paul, the slide that I saw here today, which is sticking on my mind, is the cartoon where the fellow's bending over looking at the piano stool on the sidewalk. And of course, he doesn't see the grand piano coming down on top of him, right? And I think that's the way to get the government's attention, because when you look at this on a national scale, as much as we were touched by it here today, historically it's small potatoes, right? And in the loop we're trying to close here today is that due to climate warming and climate change, it might not be small potatoes going forward, right?
So there's a trend here that's
Well, that's
frightening.
the trend has at least been suggested here, if not proven.
And proven in the US and proven.
But that's the message that I think has to go to politicians.
There may be a lack of data, but I understand that there's estimates that the socioeconomic cost of lost days at work and health will even exceed the amount of money spent for recovery or replacement of lost neighborhoods and communities. So that's a kind of a sleeper cost there. Dave.
Dave Martell. Brian Stocks is going to fall off his chair when I say this, but people are pointing fingers at government. And as Kim pointed out, most of the governments in this country are very focused on this issue. They know what they're dealing with. They're very committed to dealing with it. We could probably fault some of them on how much resources they put into it. But when people say that we need to get the attention of government, they're talking about the federal government, because that's the government that's dropped the ball on this. And quite frankly, I'm not very optimistic because of the last set of ideas that were just expressed. This is a problem that's going to grow because of climate change. And we have a government that doesn't recognize that. So to get them to buy into having to deal with this as an escalating problem means you have to convince them this is a climate change problem. So maybe you ought to just leave this with the provincial governments and let them deal with it and forget the feds.
Okay, well,
I was with you until the end.
well, in keeping with that, Dave, maybe we should shift to the next question because it is focusing down. We've got one more comment here. Please go ahead.
I just, Justin Poder from York University. I had two thoughts. One is, goes right back to what Mike Flanagan said at the beginning about how fire is a relationship between weather and fuel. And when we think about all of these thoughts relate to this idea of fuel management. So one thing to think about is how much of the future fire regime is driven by fuel versus weather and what the relationship is, because if a lot of it is driven by more severe weather, there may be a limitation to what we can accomplish by fuel management. And the other thing, a related thing, is about how we go about doing the fuel management, because the Fire Smart is valuable in the interface, but in a lot of thinking in fuel management also has to do with reintroducing fire in the landscape and doing more prescribed fire and more prescribed natural fire and those kinds of things too. So incorporating those into the analysis and the overall framework for how to manage fire in the future, I think is important.
Thanks. Gary, right behind you there.
Gary Hartwig from British Columbia. I'm another wildland guy. And Alan, I'd just like to comment that for the insurance folks in the room here, and I think you mentioned this earlier, the relationship is with homeowners. It's with people with asset structures. That's the relationship that I think is the piece that we're sort of missing. And the wildland guys, and I'm one of them, we talk feeds and speeds, big fires, big problems, millions of dollars, and yet we have, we're sort of looking for government for dollars we know they don't really have. I think one of the key aspects that an insurance industry brings is a private sector approach to trying to engage resources and that relationship with private landowners and homeowners. The financial incentive, and I'm curious to know what the thoughts are. Is there really a way to incent private landowners to adapt Fire Smart principles in a way that they can choose whether or not they reduce their premium, or maybe it doesn't go up as much, in a way that helps to engage them in all of the things we've talked about, but in a way that is, and I think Kelly O'Shea spoke to this as well, the citizen-based incentives to get action going on the private land is something that I think most of us know is really lacking. We can do the public lands, the big landscape broad programs, and that's where a lot of those millions of dollars are going. But at the end of the day that it matters, when all the embers are in the air, if there's been no mitigation directly around that home, it's not going to survive. So it has to be a balanced approach. And I think with the insurance folks in the room here, I think that's the compelling part of this discussion to me, is how to engage on that relationship with private homeowners and try to do it in a financial way that, and maybe there isn't a way to do it that puts some skin in the game, so to speak, and put some incentive on them. And again, I think local government will come along with that. Again, local governments have insurance policies. Their fire departments have insurance policies based on how well they respond to structural fires. I don't know whether that's something worth looking at. Is there a way to look at wildland risk mitigation within a community and build a product that starts to appreciate that kind of a risk assessment as well?
Yeah, well, really, I couldn't agree with you more. As being kind of co-responsible for the community of Jasper, we've done a lot of work in all of the 7 disciplines on all of the land that we're responsible for, yet I still feel that there's an awful lot of vulnerable homes. And the answer really does lie in the backyards, because if that home can't catch fire, it's not going to burn down. And if it doesn't burn down, we don't have a disaster. We don't have a claim. So that is a very important aspect, and it brings it down a whole another level. Somebody's got
Yeah, it's Adam. I wanted to expand on a couple comments that were made already today by Gary and share with the audience. We were discussing this at lunchtime, or actually it was last night. There's been a pretty strong message that's come out of the U.S. here recently. The hazardous fuels budget that the Department of Interior and the U.S. Forest Service has been reduced by $103 million annually due to the economic downturn and the situation in the U.S. And so they've sent a very clear message that what budget is available for managing hazardous fuels around communities will be prioritized based on whether or not those communities have adopted FireWise principles, and if they've demonstrated that local investment in those community-based actions. So essentially what they're saying is they're not going to continue funding landscape level fuel management practices to continue engineering these fire resilient landscapes unless it's directly tied to a community that has taken the steps to better protect themselves. So they are connecting the dots where they're seeing wildfire mitigation activities occurring in the community, in the wildland urban interface, and out in the landscape, and they're managing that bigger picture scenario.
Yeah, and once again, a lot of those solutions are known, and they're small things that can make a big difference. So that I would come back to the group with kind of a revised question then, well, how can we use that relationship that exists between insurance companies and their customers to convey that awareness or that information and spur some of those actions on?
Hi, Kevin Smart again. So insurance is a game of large numbers. And when you look at the premium that each policyholder pays, and if you divide that by the weighting of the risk of wildfire hitting their house, you'll probably find that with the spread of risk, that this ends up being a very small portion of any individual policyholder. The only way to really make it effective is to try and prioritize those areas that are most at risk and start to focus on those homeowners. So that's, again, where we come down to, if we could identify some communities, I appreciate there might be 1,000 communities at risk. And it could include Jasper, it could include Cold Lake. Slave Lake got hit, but with a bit of luck, maybe it wouldn't have been hit for 100 years. So in order to really engage where the risk is, we have to be able to identify it and then focus on those. And it could be a premium discount may not account to much for somebody who's taken all the right steps, because it amounts to such a small portion of their overall premium. So maybe working with the communities and encouraging better overall education about steps to take lessens some of the risk, but not all of it. And that's, again, we have to be able to prioritize where we focus.
Mm-hmm. So if there are other potential benefits of working together with your neighbors to reduce risk or modify fuels or things like that, whether with either building social capacity amongst your neighbors or whatever, maybe those are benefits that we should be highlighting as well. Dan.
Dan Sandy here, ICLR. Just on the topic of, the idea behind engaging insurers is sort of using financial incentives or disincentives for encouraging behavior. And as Kevin Smart says, maybe that incentive or disincentive is not going to be quite large enough. But some of the things we heard from the Slave Lake guys today, money is one thing. A lot of people depend on a payout. They sort of base their behavior on expectations for an insurance payout. But it's not just money. It's that 5-month period you're waiting for your check, the fact that you're not going to be able to have your house rebuilt for 5 years, all the other social program or problems that go along with that, with a big loss, a big fire event. It's not just getting your payout. You're not safe because you're going to get a payout. There's so many other impacts that you can experience. And making this, I wouldn't think that a lot of people would have thought about that. They sort of depend on insurance payouts. And I would imagine that a lot of municipalities would sort of have the same perspective. They would depend on a government payout or assume that insurance is going to pay out for all their residents, so they don't need to worry about it. But all the other problems that go along can be, as serious as that. So making sure people know about that might be an additional strategy.
Mm-hmm. You work with that, Peter?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment because it's, yeah, I think that's a really important comment, and it's not just about selling people on saving $20 on their insurance premium because they've done fire smart. They may save themselves 5 years of living in their daughter's basement. Sorry, Mark. And all of the pain and the loss of personal possessions. I think that's, we tend to hinge it on a differential on the premium. I think that's just a small part of the incentive. And I think Paul's point as well, that we need to look at who has incentives. And it's the homeowner, it's the federal government, it's also provincial governments. But we think we need to also consider local governments as well and the local fire department. You think about Jamie and what he went through in this particular fire. And I think we need to engage with fire departments to explain and work with them on how to avoid these type of events. Because we're all aware of the risk that firefighters go through, and it's extremely heightened in these kind of events. And I think there's a lot we can do with fire departments, and maybe, I'm not sure if now's a good time to talk about it, but Jamie and I had a short chat around sprinkler systems and engaging fire departments and mutual aid networks to for a couple of reasons. Number one is, the fire departments have a really good knowledge of how to protect their community and a huge incentive. But I think it's also really important from the perspective that even if we launched Fire Smart full bore now, you're talking for the best communities 10 years to fully protect them, and possibly 20 or more depending on funding and all kinds of issues they run into. So you've got a large gap where those communities are at risk, and setting up a network of sprinkler systems operated by local fire departments, shared by mutual aid, you can fill that gap and provide a pretty high level of protection. So I think there is a partner here that I believe in, and Gary Hartwick can speak to it as well. It's starting to work in BC. It's a program we launched after 2003, and I think other provinces are starting to come around to that. That may be a solution as well. But sorry to hog the stage for a second, but I just thought I'd get that plug in.
Just to ask a general question to the people in the insurance industry, do you think it would be seen as helpful or a service that could be provided by your friendly insurance company to receive information that helps make you more aware of a potential hazard on your property? Like, well, gee, I had no idea I should store my firewood at least 10 meters from my home because it could result in igniting my home, or putting a screen on my chimney or something like that to prevent my roof from igniting. Would that be seen as worthwhile?
It's right there. Just nail it out with policy.
Well, all information is great information. I'm an underwriter. But to my colleague's point up front, the rating factor, I'm not sure, but I would suspect that the rating factor attributed to fire when developing premium is more based on dwelling fire versus wildfire spread. So those precautions, I'm not sure would have that much of a significant impact. However, having said that, absolutely, we have an opportunity to provide information to our insureds. There's certainly potential to put it up on various websites, our own website, that sort of thing, and also mailing to clients. A targeted approach, I would suggest. I do have to count pennies. This piece would be too heavy for me to put in my renewal package. It would put me over my mailing costs, so I have to think about that. Not that I wouldn't, but that's just something that I would have to think about. Again, on a targeted approach. Not everybody has the same issues. The other thing is, is timeliness. In Alberta, the fire season starting next week, I think I heard. So we should have sent this out 2 months ago. It should have gone out with our renewals 2 months ago, right? And then we're gearing up for floods hitting or, heavy rains in August when we don't have, when our sewers are overflowing. So it really, there has to be a targeted and a timed communication plan, I think would work well as well.
Good point, thanks.
Got a third question? Third question?
Yep. One last, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a quick point. Basically, one of the main concerns in regards to fire and dwelling is how protected a community is. How many hydrants do you have? Do you have shuttle as well? I mean, those are the key factors when we look at, what your premium is going to be and how it's going to be calculated. So the better municipality is equipped, the better, the more beneficial it is for us and for the homeowners as well. So it's sort of like it works hand in hand. If they have all the protection possible, they're going to get also the better service from us.
Right.
Also, if more and more fire halls have an agreement to help each other out, I'm sure each and every fire hall has its own boundaries and its own service sections, but they also have agreements of when something big happens, another fire hall will come in. If there's more agreements like that, that's also something that helps out as well. So those are the key factors that are looked at. Education is something that the government should do anyway. In the States, in the Tornado Valley, everybody knows what to do when a tornado comes. So in Slave Lake, there's a panic. Of course, there's a panic. There's a lot of you don't know what to do and so on and so forth. But when there's an education prior to the fact of anything, God forbid, happens, that's also something that can help a community, and less things can happen. So.
Thanks. So the third question was try to point towards some priorities for ICLR to tackle when it comes to people in homes and communities, and I think we've already heard what some of those are during the course of our discussion. Any other thoughts popping around out there?
Kevin Smart again. I've been making a little list here. I like the idea of working with local fire departments to try and get them involved in reducing some of the wildfire risk. The insurance industry connection with fire departments is through the Fire Underwriters Survey. So that might be a good place to start to build relationships to encourage the local fire departments to assess wildfire risk in the area, see if they're ready for it. The pumpers and tankers that they have will quickly be overwhelmed in resources in the event of a wildfire. So start making those connections with neighboring communities on how they can work together. I think that would be a good idea. I wonder if Slave Lake would be willing to help put together a business case that can be used to be shown to other communities, municipalities. This is the cost if wildfire hits you. This is what the cost would have been for prevention. And it can make it very real, and you can also include all those emotional costs apart from the financial costs.
Great, so to use Slave Lake as a bit of a case study here.
Right. And it would still be helpful if we can help prioritize some of the risk by communities. I know there's a lot of communities everywhere that have this risk, but I'm not quite sure what the method would be, whether it's through mapping, whether it's through topology, geography, but if we could identify some of the areas that we start to focus on and give them a little priority, it makes it all manageable. You can have targeted information going out to policyholders in those areas and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Much like State Farm was indicating that they've got some system for targeting neighborhoods and where they target for hazard assessments and investigations before they write a policy. Yeah, there must be some tools.
And if we can identify some of those regions, then we can also encourage the local brokers, agents to get involved with the municipality, with the fire departments to help encourage improvements.
Yeah.
I'm just going to respond to some of the comments Kevin made. You know, in figuring out a hazard map for wildfire risk, it just, now I'm not the expert on this, I don't think, but it seems to me that the risk varies not only from one season to the next because of buildup of fuels, but from month to month, just from precipitation that falls. So it's not like an earthquake hazard map that stays relatively constant for a decade or longer, right? So you build a program, it's something that's going to change week by week. So how are you going to build that into, you know, targeting certain neighborhoods? I'm not sure how you can respond that quickly.
Well, I mean, there's no shortage of hazard maps or wildfire hazard maps in Canada. Natural Resources Canada, the Forest Service puts out at least, what, 4 varieties perhaps, Mike? Something to that effect. And we're going to discuss it at our next...
Every month, right?
They change daily during the high season. But first of all, it's important to recognize it's a hazard map, not a risk map. So how do we take that data, move it from hazard to risk? We have this discussion with earthquake, we have it with wind, right? Same old, same old. How do we move it from hazard to risk? So, you know, we're going to look into this at our next Insurance Advisory Committee meeting. That's going to be the topic. But we have to look at these maps, how they're produced, the data behind them. Is there a central repository for all that data? And how far can we go back? Because then, of course, there's the possibility to take averages and different things of that nature. I mean, I'm not an expert in it, but there's, you know, the potential to take a number of these one-day maps or however they're broken down and look at them over a longer term, providing the data, the background data is there. And then perhaps we can move this over to some sort of risk map using forward sortation areas and overlay of some sort. We have a GPS expert over here, so. But that's going to be the discussion at our next meeting. And, you know, with that sort of thing, is that the approach to take? Would that be helpful? Would that put us at least one step further than we are now, that sort of thing? But we're just really in the preliminary stages of looking at that, but that's going to be the next Insurance Advisory Committee meeting. And then, I don't know if Paul wants to talk about very briefly the other part of it, but okay.
Back to Dave.
Just to quickly point out that a number of Canadian wildland fire organizations already work with their forest management planners to do exactly that for forest stands. So if they can do it for forest stands, they can do it for communities, except it's much more complicated to deal with what's the risk that fire is going to go into the community as opposed to the risk that it's going to burn a stand. But the larger level technologies out there.
Yeah. And at the home level, there are many of the factors that accumulate hazard are kind of on-off switches. Granted, the fuel moisture will change somewhat, but most of them are fixed features, like your roof is either combustible or it's not, those kinds of things. So at the homeowner level, you can get a pretty good idea of what that hazard is, despite the changing background level of fuel moisture and weather changes. And there's some good systems out there for that.
Yeah, I would just add to that discussion as well. As Dave had alluded to, there are agencies there are models and tools out there that we can use to assess wildfire risk and wildfire hazard. We look at a wildfire threat rating that considers fire behavior potential, fire occurrence risk, values at risk, and suppression capability. Like any model or tool, what information comes out is only as good as the information that goes in. And the comment that was being made about how the landscape was always changing, it requires that we work with our forest management branches to help with keeping current the fuels information. But I don't know if Peter wanted to add to this conversation as well with the work that BC had done after Kelowna with their provincial wildfire threat analysis, is looking at using some of the NFPA standards, looking at structural density and what the fire environment around a community is, to evaluate what level of risk and what type of fire hazard there is.
Okay, well, we don't want to overstay our welcome here. So I think there's some great information out there, and there's still lots of fingers going up in the air, but we'll leave you with Tracy's email address and ask that if you would, please send her an email with some more ideas, and we'll try to get the PDF of this presentation out to you all quickly so that you can, if it will trigger any more ideas or thoughts. So thank you very much for your contributions, and I think Peter and Brian have some good information to go forward with.
Thank you, Alan. Everybody join in thanking Alan for leading us today. Okay, on behalf of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, thank you for taking the time to be here today. I hope you found this informative and a good investment of your time today. We want to thank you for coming and participating in the discussion. Thanks to the many speakers who are involved today in giving presentations. Thanks to Brian and Peter, who are going to be writing this up afterward and put together a report. Thanks to Natural Resources Canada for funding to help facilitate putting on today's session. We will welcome all of your feedback and comments. If you fire an email to anybody at ICLR, we will take your thoughts in terms of any ideas you would like to share with us of something that should be captured in terms of something you learned today or would be a good lesson to share with other people who might want to read about our event. We are filming this, and that's something we're going to stick on. Glenn, we'll stick that on the internet or whatever?
Yeah, YouTube channel.
YouTube. Anybody who wants to watch this again or tell somebody else there was some part of this you found interesting and you want to encourage them to watch it, it's all available that way. So please feel free to use it. But again, thank you all for your time, and I hope you've learned as much as I have today in terms of participating. That's the end. Thanks.